When the shed first went up in the northeastern corner of the backyard, it was nothing more than a modest, weather-resistant structure meant to store tools, seasonal decorations, and the lawnmower that had long lived under a tarp. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even visible from the street unless someone went out of their way to crane their neck over the side fence. To the homeowner, it was simply practical. An inexpensive way to tidy up the yard and keep things protected from the creeping winters that swept through the neighborhood every year. But not everyone saw it that way. Specifically, the neighbor living directly behind the property didn't see a shed at all. She saw an affront to the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, as she proudly described her perceived mission to anyone who would listen. She was the sort of neighbor who had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of property values, armed with binoculars, printouts of HOA guidelines from 3 years ago, and a crusader-like passion for enforcement that outshone even the actual HOA board. And even though the shed was fully compliant with every listed guideline, she had decided it wasn't to her. The addition represented chaos, disorder, a threat to the pristine uniformity she believed the community depended on. And once she decided something was wrong, there was never a chance of changing her mind. The homeowner began to notice small signs of her agitation almost immediately. Her blinds shifted whenever he walked outside, snapping closed as soon as he looked in her direction. Footprints began appearing suspiciously close to the shared fence line. The sound of her muttering floated over the yard whenever she believed no one else was nearby. Still, the shed remained entirely legal. A copy of the HOA regulations was taped inside the garage, highlighting the lines that permitted accessory structures behind the primary home, so long as they remained within height and material restrictions. The shed met every one of them. It sat far from property boundaries, was constructed of HOA-approved materials, and even matched the color palette used on the house. For a few weeks, it seemed like the situation would blow over, another moment of pettiness destined to fade into the endless churn of neighborhood drama. But the neighbor thrived on escalation. Quiet annoyance never satisfied her. She needed action, response, impact. Her suspicious patrols grew more frequent and more forceful. She measured things along the fence line with a laser tool. She scribbled notes on a clipboard. She crouched low to the ground and peered under the slats as though hunting for contraband. Then, abruptly, the real trouble began. One morning, a neon orange notice fluttered on the front door like a warning flag. It bore the city seal, informing the homeowner that an anonymous complaint had been filed alleging construction of an unpermitted structure. It instructed him to schedule an inspection within a defined period or face potential fines. There was no name listed, just the coldly generic phrasing of a city form paired with a nudge toward compliance. He didn't need a signature to know who had filed it. The inspection wasn't something he feared. He had the paperwork ready, including past email confirmations from the HOA Architectural Committee. The shed was allowed. Permits weren't required for structures under a certain square footage, and his fell well below that threshold. Still, the disruption brought a sour heaviness to the atmosphere of the home. The shed had been meant to simplify his life, not rip open a new channel of neighborly hostility. The appointed day arrived, and with it, the city inspector. He didn't seem particularly concerned, barely glancing at the shed before requesting the documents. The homeowner provided everything, and the inspector nodded, flipping through the neatly organized folder. It took only minutes for him to confirm compliance. No violations, no issues, no fines. But what the inspector did notice was the neighbor. She hovered near the property line like a bird of prey waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in. She moved with exaggerated frustration, huffing, pacing, and repeatedly glancing toward the inspector while pretending to tend her flower bed. Every few seconds, she looked over with a dramatic expression that practically demanded attention. It was as though she expected the inspector to march over and congratulate her for her vigilance. Instead, the inspector simply concluded his brief assessment and prepared to leave. That could have been the end. Quiet, anticlimactic, unremarkable. But the neighbor couldn't allow that. Not when she believed justice hadn't been served. Not when she saw a compliant shed where she wanted to see a demolition order. She flagged the inspector down with a force that suggested life or death urgency. From the homeowner's vantage point, her gestures were sharp and animated. her voice rising in intensity even though the words were muffled by the fence. The inspector paused, responding with a calmness that seemed to irritate her further. She pointed toward the shed several times, then toward the yard, then back at the inspector, as if demanding that he fix what she insisted was a grave problem. The inspector's expression changed, but not in the way she must have hoped. His posture stiffened subtly, his tone cooled, and he asked her something that made her falter. Her arms dropped slightly. A tension flickered across her face. Just a flash, but enough to suggest she had been caught off guard. Then the inspector spoke again, more firmly this time, and the neighbor's bravado cracked. Her eyes darted toward her house as if suddenly remembering something she had overlooked. She attempted to redirect the conversation, but the inspector pointed not at the shed, but at her own property. The moment was brief but unmistakable. Something had shifted. She retreated hurriedly across her lawn, her steps uneven and uneasy, while the inspector made a few notes on his tablet. The homeowner didn't know yet what had just happened. All he knew was that the complaint had fizzled, and the shed remained standing. The inspector left without further comment, offering a quick professional nod before returning to his vehicle. But as the homeowner walked back toward the house, he noticed something unexpected. The neighbor's blinds, usually snapped shut with obsessive precision, were left askew. And her side gate, never anything less than padlocked, was cracked open. A nervous energy seemed to ripple from her property, as though she knew something was coming. The shed had never been the real problem. It was simply the spark that lit a much larger fire. And while the homeowner didn't yet understand the magnitude of what the inspector had discovered, he would soon. Because the next time the city vehicle returned, the visit wouldn't be for him. The neighborhood settled into an uneasy quiet after the inspector's first visit. Days passed without further notices or unexpected interruptions, yet the atmosphere remained heavy, an unspoken tension hanging between the yards like dense fog. The shed stood in its corner, perfectly still and perfectly legal, but now it seemed to carry a strange significance. It had become the center point of a storm that hadn't yet finished forming. The neighbor, so bold, so vigilant, so eager to enforce rules upon others, had retreated into a kind of watchful uncertainty. Her blinds, once snapping open and shut with aggressive precision, now remained tilted, as though she couldn't decide whether to conceal herself or keep a close eye on her surroundings. Her usual patterns changed. The constant pacing along the fence line stopped. The dramatic appearances in the yard ceased. She moved differently now, with shorter steps, as if she feared drawing attention. It was the kind of shift that hinted at a deeper problem, one that had nothing to do with the shed at all. The homeowner noticed other peculiarities as the week progressed. The neighbor's side gate, typically secured with an industrial-grade lock, had been left unfastened on 3 separate occasions. Old buckets and unused lumber appeared beside her house as though someone had hastily moved things out of sight. The backyard, usually trimmed to an obsessive level of tidiness, showed signs of neglect. A patch of grass, previously kept at immaculate uniform height, had begun to grow unevenly. Several potted plants near her patio, once meticulously arranged, now sat dry and wilted. Something had disrupted the pristine order she had always demanded, not only from others, but from herself. And then, one morning, the city truck reappeared. Its arrival was unmistakable. The rumble of tires, the flash of the municipal seal, the slow and deliberate parking position directly in front of the neighbor's home. The homeowner watched from a distance, not out of curiosity but because the return visit was impossible to ignore. City inspections rarely occurred without reason, and they almost never came in pairs unless someone had stepped far outside the boundaries of compliance. The inspector from before stepped out, carrying a tablet and a folder. His demeanor was more focused this time, his attention directed entirely toward the neighbor's property. He scanned the exterior slowly, taking in details that would have seemed invisible to an average passerby. His gaze lingered on the garage door, the slanted rain gutter, the old attic vent, and the side yard where worn-down boards leaned against the wall. After several minutes, he walked up the neighbor's driveway and knocked firmly on the door. There was no immediate answer. The inspector waited, then tried again, this time with a noticeable pause afterward. Eventually, the door opened just wide enough for the neighbor to peer out. Her posture suggested reluctance, shoulders pulled inward, head angled just enough to see without being fully seen. Her reaction to whatever the inspector said was visible even without hearing the words. Her face tightened. She shook her head quickly. Then she attempted to wave something away, as though dismissing an accusation she knew she couldn't refute. The inspector maintained a professional stance, but his gestures indicated an insistence she couldn't dodge. He pointed toward her backyard. He pointed toward the side of her house. Then he tapped something on his tablet and stepped back, waiting for her response. The neighbor hesitated. A moment later, she opened the door fully, stepping out with the air of someone reluctantly agreeing to a process she no longer had the power to control. She guided the inspector around the property, her movements stiff and edged with nervousness. The homeowner kept his distance. He didn't need to hover or eavesdrop. The situation was unfolding exactly as the inspector had hinted during his first visit. Whatever violations he had discovered on her property clearly outweighed the baseless complaint she had filed about the shed as the two disappeared behind the neighbor's fence. The silence that followed felt weighted, thick and anticipatory. The inspection lasted far longer than the one conducted on the shed. 10 minutes stretched to 20, then 30. The inspector moved between different sections of the yard, documenting, observing, measuring. Each time he appeared briefly above the fence line, his expression remained unchanged, but his pace suggested thoroughness. When he and the neighbor finally emerged again, her posture had completely shifted. Gone was the righteous confidence that had fueled her crusade. In its place was a tight, uneasy rigidity. She crossed her arms as though bracing herself against an incoming blow. The inspector spoke in calm, even tones while showing her something on his tablet. She glanced at the screen and visibly flinched, then muttered something while wringing her hands. The inspector continued, tapping through more information, more violations, more documentation. By the time the discussion ended, the neighbor looked drained, deflated, even. She accepted a printed notice with trembling fingers and avoided eye contact with anyone, including the inspector. The homeowner didn't need to see the paper to understand its meaning. It carried the same city insignia he had received before, but this time the consequences weren't the result of a complaint. They were the result of her own actions. And unlike the fully compliant shed, her property apparently contained issues she had hoped would remain hidden. Only when the inspector drove away did the full impact settle over the block. The neighbor stood motionless at the edge of her driveway, the notice clutched in her hand like a verdict. Eventually, she retreated indoors, closing her door with a gentleness entirely uncharacteristic of her usual forcefulness. In the hours that followed, changes became immediately visible. She paced her backyard with frantic energy, inspecting corners and structures as though rediscovering the reality she had tried desperately to ignore. She dragged heavy items away from her fence. She gathered debris from behind the shed-sized structure she herself had built years earlier, an old storage unit that appeared far larger and far less compliant than the one she had complained about. Paint peeled from its walls. The roof sagged slightly. A section of it leaned precariously close to the property boundary. It had been there long before the homeowner arrived. Hidden behind tall shrubs and her strategic landscaping choices, it had never drawn attention, until her complaint brought an inspector close enough to notice it. The irony was unmistakable. Her attempt to weaponize city enforcement had backfired. The shed she despised had been legal. The structure she had hoped to keep concealed was not. As daylight faded and the neighbor continued her frantic efforts, the homeowner realized a deeper truth. She had spent so many years policing others that she had forgotten her own vulnerabilities. She had lived under the assumption that she was untouchable. But the very system she had tried to manipulate had turned on her with unwavering impartiality. The shed had simply been the spark. The real fire had always been waiting, and now it was spreading into consequences she could no longer outrun. The days that followed were marked by a visible unraveling. Slow at first, then rapid, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. The neighbor who once patrolled the block like a self-appointed warden now slipped in and out of her home as though avoiding detection. Gone was her rigid posture, her confident stride, her habit of peering over fences and monitoring every perceived infraction. She moved instead with caution, shoulders drawn inward, her steps quick and uncertain. Even the blinds that once twitched open at the slightest disturbance remained closed, as if she no longer wanted to see the world outside, or be seen by it. But the world outside saw her anyway. Word of the city inspector's second visit spread through the neighborhood with astonishing speed. Neighbors who had quietly tolerated her overbearing behavior for years exchanged subtle glances when she walked by. Conversations paused as she approached. A few residents, emboldened by her sudden vulnerability, began asking questions about what the inspector had found. They didn't direct those questions to her, they didn't need to. The visible changes around her property already hinted at the truth. For nearly a decade, she had operated under the assumption that she could enforce rules without following them. The structure in her backyard, the oversized shed she had hidden behind tall shrubs and clever staging, stood as a monument to her hypocrisy. It was far larger than regulations allowed, built with outdated materials that no longer met code, and situated dangerously close to the property line. Worse still, the inspector had noted additional violations: an illegally modified drainage pipe directing runoff toward a neighboring yard, an improperly wired outdoor lighting system, and a fence repair she had performed without a permit years earlier. These were not small issues. They were structural, electrical, and environmental, serious violations that carried real consequences. Within a week, she received a formal correction order from the city outlining the steps required to bring her property into compliance. It wasn't a simple list. It was a multi-page directive demanding significant repairs, updated permits, inspections, and proof of proper remediation. The city gave her deadlines, and the deadlines were not lenient. Failure to comply would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. She had once bragged about her knowledge of regulations. Now she was drowning in them. Contractors began arriving at her home shortly thereafter. Their trucks clogged her driveway. Their equipment cluttered her lawn. They moved around her property under the watchful eye of city oversight, tearing down parts of the structure she had carefully concealed for so many years. Boards came off in long, splintered strips. Rusted nails clattered onto the concrete. Each removed piece exposed more issues, more rot, more evidence of neglect. From across the fence, the homeowner could hear the shuffle of materials, the heavy thud of dismantled beams hitting the ground, the low hum of tools correcting years-old mistakes. The shed she had criticized had stood clean and tidy. Her own, by contrast, had been decaying quietly behind the screen of her pride. Her reaction to all of this was not loud. She didn't scream or rant or confront anyone. The change was internal, a collapse of the identity she had spent so long cultivating. Without her self-appointed authority, she seemed unsure how to exist in the neighborhood she once dominated. She avoided eye contact with everyone. She hurried into her home at the first sign of attention. Even her yard, once a reflection of her control, became a landscape of disarray as construction materials piled up and large patches of ground were dug open for repairs. And yet, despite her attempts to hide, the situation became more public than she could have imagined. One morning, a city vehicle arrived again. This time, it wasn't just an inspector. It was a compliance officer carrying a camera used for documentation. They photographed her side yard, the dismantled structure, the exposed wiring, the damaged gutter system. They spoke quietly to one another, making notes on their devices. The homeowner observed from a respectful distance, knowing the officer's presence meant that her violations were now officially part of the city's public record. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Animated whispers spread through the block. Another neighbor posted an update in the local community forum, referencing a major compliance issue, without naming names. Though everyone already knew who they meant, curious residents walked by, pretending to check their mail or water their plants while casting lingering glances at the unfolding scene. Her reputation, once based on intimidation and strict self-imposed authority, began to crumble under the weight of her own exposed infractions. But the final blow came not from the city, nor from the neighbors, nor from any official process. It came from the HOA. The same HOA she had weaponized for years. The same HOA she constantly pressured to enforce rules on others. The same HOA she flooded with complaints, emails, photos, and demands. They too had received the city's report. And with it, they finally had the documentation they needed to take long overdue action against her. The HOA issued their own notice. an extensive violation letter outlining every rule she had broken over the years, including unauthorized modifications, failure to maintain her property, and behavior that had caused ongoing disruption within the community. The letter ended with an unmistakable statement. She would be subject to substantial fines unless she completed all necessary corrections and attended a mandatory compliance meeting. Her attempts to avoid accountability had led her straight into the deepest level of it. Days later, the homeowner happened to see her in the backyard for the first time in weeks. She stood near the now dismantled remains of her illegal structure, staring at the barren space where it once stood. Her expression carried none of the superiority she once flaunted. It was something far more human: exhaustion, regret, and perhaps, in the smallest measure, humility. The shed she had complained about remained untouched, unchanged, peacefully occupying its quiet corner of the yard. It had never been the problem. The real issue had always been her desire for control, her fixation on enforcing rules she herself ignored, and her belief that she could manipulate the system without consequence. In the end, the system had proven otherwise. Months later, the neighborhood settled into a calmer rhythm. The homeowners went about their lives without constant surveillance. The air felt lighter, freer. The neighbor still lived behind the fence, but her presence had softened. She no longer patrolled the streets. She no longer measured fences. Sometimes she sat quietly in her yard, reading or tending a few newly planted flowers, no longer as a performance, but simply as part of living. The shed, still sturdy and unbothered, stood as a symbol of the turning point, the moment the inspector uncovered the truth she had tried to hide. It had sparked a chain of events that reset the balance of the neighborhood. In the end, justice hadn't required confrontation or revenge. It had simply required the truth to be seen.